These are ultimately decisions about claims about people's lives, and we want people to trust these decisions.
Medieval crimes are being committed.
I come with clean hands.
Victims of horrific crimes want justice.
We don't have anything better than this.
This is Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast, with Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg.
All rise.
Hi, Janet.
Hi, Steph.
We're still processing some of the materials that we recorded before the summer break. So when we get really busy and a lot of international law stuff happened, and it was especially tied in to the ways that Ukraine is making use of accountability systems and making stuff happen in our world.
Yeah, I kind of wonder whether we're ever going to be able to stay on top of everything Ukraine related, because there's just so much of it. But in the meantime, in case you don't know very much about what we're going to do today, which is the Register of Damages, and on the potential for a claims commission, we will have 2 podcasts for you.
Yes, I did an interview with Markiyan Kliuchkovskyi, who is the executive director of the Register of Damages, which was set up here in The Hague.
Oh, yes, I remember you actually went to his offices, didn't you? They are here in The Hague, aren't they?
Yeah, they're like at a stone's throw from the International Court of Justice, so you can see the Peace Palace almost. And I'd met him in that it's kind of a soulless office building. They're still just getting set up. And we were chatting, but it was a bit noisy because we're right off the kitchen where everybody's meeting.
That's the way sometimes, isn't it? I'm going to look forward to listen to what he had to say. Before we play that, I think we should try and give some of the background that people need. And I should also mention again that I did an interview with one of the women who's behind the scenes. She's kind of this extraordinary expert of claims commissions. Her name is Professor Chiara Giorgetti, and as I know nothing about claims commissions, honestly a complete fail on my part. I barely even heard of them. I kind of knew there was an Iran-US one, but nothing more than that, not really. So before we get that background, just to mention again, there'll be a second podcast that we're going to put out separately on our Patreon feed. So if you want to listen to that in conjunction with Markiyan, do sign up to support us there. And you can hear that interview with Chiara, and then we'll put it on the main feed later.
So first we turn to the Register of Damages. This is a body set up where Ukrainians can register what damage they suffered from the Russian invasion. They had a special portal that opened in April where you could do it on the internet. And it's come about partly under the auspices of the Council of Europe.
Yeah, that's really interesting in itself. I'm trying to still get my head around what this Council of Europe can do. They were meeting in Vilnius, where I'm usually based, last week. The week before that. And there was a lot of talk about this claims commission and how they're making this registry of damages happen.
Yeah, it seems like the Council of Europe is really kind of also branching out itself and seeing what it can do in Ukraine and really kind of jumping in that space to create these kind of mechanisms. When I spoke to Markiyan in the beginning of July, at that stage, the registry was really kind of in test mode. People had already submitted to the Ukraine authorities some of their damages that were then kind of pushed through to the claims registry. But in the more recent months, that has changed. The people who can apply at the moment are anyone who has suffered damage after the 22nd of February 2022, so the date of the Russian invasion, the full-scale Russian invasion, I think we have to say. But as Markiyan explained, the registry of damages is only the first part, and there's a lot more to come before they can provide full reparations for Ukrainians.
So the concept for the reparations project is what we call a compensation mechanism. And it has, in principle, 3 main pillars. The first is what we are, the Register of Damage. So we are receiving and recording claims for compensation of damage. We are not examining them on substance. We're just checking that they are eligible and recording them, adding them to the record of the register. Then after that, the claims should be transferred to the second pillar, what we call the Claims Commission. That's the body that will review them, examine them, adjudicate them, whatever the word, and determine the compensation due in each individual case. And then the third pillar is what we call a compensation fund, is from where these awards will be paid out. So far, the second and third pillar do not exist yet. They have not been yet established. The first pillar is, which is the register. We're now functioning, operating, and also contributing to the work on the second and third pillar.
And the portal opened in April, I believe, where people could file claims, but I understood that it's only to people who had claimed before in Ukraine. Now it's supposed to open more widely, or maybe it has opened more widely. Can you say something about the numbers you were seeing?
So that's right. We started receiving claims on the 2nd of April. We started with a single category, that is damage and destruction to residential immovable property. So housing, apartments and houses that people live in. We are going in phases because we are also at the same time building the technical infrastructure for this process from the scratch, effectively, as we are relying on a completely digital process, both in terms of the submission of claims and what is being submitted. So we started as our initial step in which we opened a subset, effectively, of that category to include the people who have already applied for this Ukrainian governmental program called e-recovery. That is very similar to what we're doing, and it has the additional element of their claims being verified by local authorities. So the damage that they claim was inspected and at least some degree of verification was added. So that creates a pretty complete set of evidence for us that we can draw on, and in the process make sure that all of our systems, all of our integrations work. So that subset includes about 70,000 people that have applied to the Ukrainian program. We have several thousand of them making claims, submitting claims to us. But this is just the beginning. I feel a little bit strange talking about that number because it is often seen in the context of the large scale and expectation, because we do expect between 6 and 8 million claims overall. And so the database is growing effectively by the day. Gives us food for thought how to handle these large number of claims.
What's your background to be doing this, in the sense, because it's a very particular set of skills, I imagine. There is a bit that is likened to somebody who does insurances. There's a lot of legal things and there's some, I guess, a psychological aspect of dealing with people who have suffered damages and looking at how you do that. How do you come to this?
Well, I mean, the war taught us that we can go beyond our immediate skill set, and then taught millions of people in Ukraine that. In my case, that may not necessarily sound very modest, but I was in the first couple of weeks of the war. I remember that very vividly. I was sitting in my car in the parking garage in the basement of my building that doubled as a bomb shelter. And it was a very long air raid throughout the night. It was early March. It was very cold. I was very miserable and very angry. And I wanted to do something about it. And I've spent almost 20 years in international dispute resolution, international arbitration. So my mindset is quite well trained in terms of finding ways to sue those who cause damage. So I started thinking about ways to do that. And that evolved through cooperation with others, colleagues and the Ukrainian government into the concept of this compensation mechanism. And we pitched that first to the government, then with the Ukrainian government internationally, and I was able to contribute to its establishment through negotiation and through that process. So after that, I was nominated to serve as executive director. So to say that I have a specific skill set to run this, not by training, because I don't think that anybody has that skill set. There's a very small number of people worldwide who have done that before, who have created these claims programs. And I'm thankful to be in touch and working with many of them. But it's just a matter of getting things done as best as we can.
How are you promoting this register in Ukraine and abroad? We've seen the kind of governments agreeing to it, but do you have outreach to Ukrainians on how to file these kind of claims?
Yeah, so our outreach is in its infancy. much like all of our other systems. We do have a program that is being developed, and we'll start implementing it because this is fundamentally one of the critical elements. We need people to be aware of the register, why it exists, how it works, what it takes to submit the claim, and why should they bother, especially considering that the other steps in that process are not given. Let's say. So we are working on that program. It will be a complex program. It will have something as basic as just, publication of information in various forms, starting with our website and social media, and working with the press and using other stakeholders, including first and foremost the Ukrainian government that has a lot of channels of communication to simply spread the word, but also doing a more direct outreach specifically to our potential claimants. So communities, people in Ukraine, municipalities, businesses. I should maybe correct myself and say not only people in Ukraine, but also people outside of Ukraine, because there are about 6 million Ukrainians that are now outside of its borders that are all potential claimants.
So there's a little update of this because, of course, this was an interview we had in July and some things have changed since then. The board of the Registry of Damages met in The Hague at the beginning of September, and they've now also opened up claims beyond the category of, quote, damage and destruction of housing. They have some new categories, a lot of them actually, and they cover a wide array of things. There's also a category for people who suffered involuntary displacement out of Ukraine, sexual violence, serious personal injury, torture, forced labor, deprivation of liberty, forced deportation and forcible transfer of children and adults, something that you can hear we talked to him about before, but also things like loss of employment, loss of private enterprise, and damage not only to residential buildings, but also non-residential buildings. Later, I asked Markiyan more about all the categories, but even though the registry is now open for people also living in the Russian-occupied territories, I wondered if people would feel safe enough to actually register and send their stuff to this registry.
Well, there's always going to be a concern because when we're talking about an occupying power in the realities that we face in these territories of Ukraine, there's always going to be a risk. We hope that we can help mitigate the risk a little bit by allowing people to submit these things digitally. So they do not have to physically go anywhere. They can just sit at home and from a computer or even a phone make that claim. Most of evidence is digital. So that hopefully they can do it from the comfort and privacy of their homes to the extent that it exists in the occupied territories without anybody really knowing that they did that. But of course, the risks will always exist, and there's probably a limit to what can be done about that in these territories, because as far as we are concerned, there's no rule of law, there's no real order in these areas. But we are making a conscious effort to allow these people to submit claims, understanding that they may not have access to some of the Ukrainian databases, some of the Ukrainian registers. They may be limited in how they're able to collect evidence. So we'll just take all of that into account.
You spoke already about the total number of claims you expect, but also what can people claim for?
Yeah, so we intend to be as broad and as comprehensive as possible. We have a list of categories of claims that has been approved. It's published on our website. We have in all 44 different categories of claims with some degree of overlap. So they're broken down primarily based on the type of a claimant, so between individuals, businesses, and the government. And it includes both material and non-material damage. So everything from loss of life, serious injury, consequences of things that we commonly refer to as war crimes, such as torture and sexual violence and detention, deportation, and such, forced displacement. And of course, property related claims, economic claims such as loss of revenue, loss of livelihood, loss of gainful employment, and things like that. Then on the legal entities side, it's more property and economic focused, of course, but we also have categories related to damage to the environment, damage to historic, cultural, and religious heritage. A large category, we expect to be a large category related to demining and removal of unexploded ordnance. That's a big problem and a costly exercise. So we intend to be as broad as possible. There will be limits, of course, because we are, in the end of the day, guided by international law in terms of what can be compensable and what is linked closely enough to the Russian aggression. But as I said, the intention is to be broad and comprehensive in that sense.
You expect a huge amount of claims and essentially mountains of paperwork. Are there any indications of how long this process will take? Is there anything comparable done?
I think the most comparable mechanism was the UNCC, the UN Compensation Commission, that was established after Iraq had invaded Kuwait in 1990. It was established the following year and had worked for 31 years. So it, incidentally and somewhat ironically, it formally concluded its work about a week before Russia invaded Ukraine. So it started in 1991, finished formally in 2022. And that commission handled close to 2 million claims. So this mechanism expects to be 3 to 4 times bigger than that in terms of number of claims. But we also have leverage of technology that is 30 years more advanced than in the 90s, starting with the way the claims are submitted and ending with the tools that can be used to process and analyze that information. So we hope to be faster than that. In reality, we cannot make that prognosis, that forecast. We do not know yet. Part of that is because the next steps of the compensation mechanism are not yet established. But we want to make sure that especially people get compensation that is effective. That means not only within their lifetimes, but also within some reasonable amount of time. Compensation is going to be valid even 30, 50, and 70 years from now, but we want that to be effective for the people who have suffered some sort of a loss.
And then we've already went through the different mechanisms that need to be established before people could see any payment. But then we get to the big question of this fund is how will you get the money to pay people out? Who decides it, and what are you going to do when you can't properly fund it? And I don't mean in the sense that you won't get any money, because it seems obvious that you will get some money. But I draw an analogy with the ICC's Trust Fund for Victims, which is voluntary, which gets some small amount of money, but is not nearly enough for what judges say that victims at the ICC should be compensated for. And you see that they really have very small amounts to kind of not to play with, but to hand out and have a real issue making meaningful reparation. So I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
The primary foundation of our thinking in that sense is that there is only one source of money, that is Russia. Because the fundamental principle upon which all of this mechanism is built is that under international law, Russia is under obligation to make reparations. So while voluntary contributions and various forms of reparation is, of course, a good thing and should be encouraged to the extent possible, this is not what this mechanism is about. Because the scope of damage being inflicted on Ukrainians is, to generalize, is in the hundreds of billions. So no voluntary contribution in the world can cover that. So what the system that we are designing is aimed at Russia contributing in some way or form to these payments. The form of that contribution is ultimately the biggest question. If Russia somehow cooperates with this mechanism, as unlikely as it seems now, it's one modality and the system should work with that. If Russia does not want to cooperate, then it's a different modality, and we take a look at the alternatives, including potentially the frozen assets. But in the end of the day, it's Russia that must be paying as opposed to somebody else.
And you said that before you spent years in conflict resolution and arbitration cases. And one of the big caveats we hear against this use of frozen Russian assets is that all the people involved in arbitration and international law don't like it because it would open up. There is legal questions about doing that. I wonder how likely the use of the frozen asset seems to you at this moment.
It's certainly very complicated in the sense that it hasn't been done before, ever. There's a single legal issue related to that. That's an issue of sovereign immunity. So that's a bar that protects assets owned by a state from things like common arbitration and litigation. So in my previous life, I would probably not even have a prayer of accessing these funds for any of my claimants. But this is different because we are talking about access to these assets as a response to an act of aggression by that state. An act of aggression conceivably is the most egregious violation of international law that goes against everything upon which the modern system of international law is built, including the UN Charter. So the philosophical question, the big picture question that we are asking is whether a state that commits that violation can hide behind a different rule of international law to shield itself from responsibility. That's a very big step, of course, because that has never been answered in the way we want it to be answered. But that's also probably the most overt and most blatant act of aggression since the establishment of the UN and the Charter and the entire modern system of international law. We have to also understand, and getting into legal nitty-gritty a little bit, that sovereign immunity is not a static concept. It's a concept of customary international law that is ultimately shaped by state practice, and it evolves over time. So the examples that we often use is that before 1945, the concept of putting a head of state on trial was unthinkable, and then in 1945 it happened. Before 60s and 70s, there was no such thing as a commercial exception to sovereign immunity. So all the assets owned by a state, regardless of how they are used and what purpose, were by definition protected. And then states, by their practice, created this exception that if the assets are purely commercial and used in commercial transactions, they are not protected by sovereign immunity. So the question is, should there be another exception to this, shaped by state practice, where a state commits an act of aggression? Should it be an exception that allows recourse to the assets of that state to compensate the victims of that aggression?
In legal terms, does it help your organization then if this tribunal for aggression that Ukraine is also working on gets established, because it's another way to establish aggression took place, which then might open more of a door for you to claim that for compensation?
Not directly. Again, semantics matter here, and we do not equate an act of aggression with a crime of aggression. A crime of aggression is something where individuals are responsible, political and military leadership of a country in this case. An act of aggression is where the state is responsible. And so we are not contingent on the establishment of the tribunal or any verdicts or determinations there. But of course, politically speaking, these are all parts of the same big accountability equation. So we are, of course, following that process, and we'll see how that goes. But we are again talking about an act of aggression, more specifically in violation of Article 2 of the UN Charter, so the most sort of rock-solid rules of international law, peremptory rules of international law. And we think that there must be a recourse against a state that violates them, even if that state sits on the Security Council as a permanent member, which ultimately is the heart of the problem here.
And who would decide in the end on the compensation?
Since, again, coming back for a second to the question of Security Council and the inability to make decisions there because of Russian veto, it's down to action by able and willing states. That's how the register was established. The sort of big international political mandate for that was given in November 22 when the General Assembly adopted resolution for furtherance of remedy and reparation for aggression against Ukraine, where basically this mechanism was outlined and it's in the hands of states, effectively, both the establishment of the mechanism itself and more specifically the use of Russian assets.
And you worked very closely also with the Council of Europe on this and then got kind of the stamp of approval of the General Assembly. And so that is also kind of the route you're looking at for a more final decision?
It's one of the ways. So we operate under the umbrella of the Council of Europe as the register. So Council of Europe member states answered the call of the General Assembly resolution by establishing the register. And like I said, it's in the hands of able and willing states. The more, the better it is for the purposes of legitimacy of the process, because these things cannot be established by tiny minorities. So we are working on that to increase the coalition of these states around these issues. The resolution in General Assembly was supported by 94 states. That's not a small number. So we strive towards that.
This is the questions I had, but on the podcast I always ask, is there something that you want to say or something that I didn't ask about the register, but you think is important to say anyway?
It is very important to look at the compensation mechanism as a general concept, not just the register, but more generally, as a way of upholding rules and principles of international law. Sometimes the talk is about the dangerous precedent that it sort of creates by going outside of the normal channels, outside of Security Council in Chapter 7, outside of the UN, and so on and so forth. And that precedent can then be replicated in unsavory ways, to which our response is that the precedent that would be set if there is no compensation mechanism, that the state can commit this sort of violation, this sort of destruction without facing any consequences, is much worse and much more dangerous. So we have to be very prudent and very thoughtful about how we go about building this mechanism. We have to make sure that it cannot be used in unsavory ways afterwards, but we have to build it because there was a violation, there are consequences for it. They must be faced. And Ukraine and its people, they not only need means to rebuild their country and their lives, but they also need to get a sense of justice for what had happened, because it's difficult to imagine how they could do it otherwise.
I'm going to ask one more question because we will use it on the podcast, and on the podcast we always end with the question that you can't prepare for. But we ask the people we interview if there is anything to tell us what is on their nightstand or in their viewing queue, or what you listen to, watched, read, can be international law related, or it cannot be, what you do to not think about register and damages, but also if you have something that relates to that, that our listeners might enjoy.
So a lot of my thinking is about AI. That it's not a very unique answer, but my interest in that is very pragmatic and very practical. If we are successful, we'll have, let's say, 6 million of claims with 6 files per claim. That's 36 million files to go through. Obviously, it's not possible to do it manually, so we have to rely on modern tools, and AI is part of that. We need to understand how to use it, what tools to use it, and how to use them in a proper and responsible and reliable way. So obviously we're not talking about ChatGPT here. We're talking about something more sophisticated. So while we are a little bit away from actually applying that, we want to be prepared for that. So my daytime, nighttime, plane time reading and podcast listening and YouTube watching is a lot about that, to understand what it is. You know, I'm a lawyer, so I'm not naturally inclined to understand these technical things, but I want to learn about them, how to use them for the benefit of this system. And that is a fascinatingly interesting subject.
Any particular podcast, YouTube commentator you would recommend?
I absorb everything, to be honest with you. I do not necessarily follow specific podcasts, but rather following people who know this stuff and talk about this stuff from a point of view of practical knowledge. So anytime there is a researcher of AI talking about it, or or owner or CEO or a participant of one of the AI programs, from OpenAI to Google to Amazon to all the little startups. I mean, this way I was cycling to work, and I was listening to a podcast about Perplexity AI, so AI-based search engine, effectively. That is all really interesting because it helps me understand what it is out there from a very non-technical perspective, to get a picture of how these tools can be applied to stuff like that. In the end of the day, our database will be very, very large, but it also will be very structured and what we call closed-cycled. So it's not an unlimited database. It's not like, ChatGPT having to learn everything that is out there in the world of knowledge. So we are quite certain that we can make good use of that. But you also have to make it in a way that is fair, that is responsible, and that will be seen as responsible. Because these are ultimately decisions about claims about people's lives. And we want people to trust these decisions.
Well, I think that was great. Thank you, Steph, for both all the background there and the substantial amount of information that Markiyan managed to supply to you. I keep on seeing announcements to say that they're doing more and more. And I do think this subject you just mentioned at the end there, artificial intelligence, we have to do some podcasts about how kind of central that is becoming in many of the processes that we look at. And I just want to say, I actually tried out this thing, Perplexity, that he mentions. It was quite nice to have an alternative to Google to find some specific sources.
Yeah, I hear a lot of those things also about in some of the AI podcasts I follow, but we're definitely going to keep an eye on both the AI developments in international justice and in general, and the registry of damage for the future. Another thing we should mention is that there was also a preparatory meeting for the international instrument to establish a claims commission in Ukraine, which was also in The Hague in the early days of September.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting to watch this going stage by stage and see how kind of the internationals get involved. I understand that meeting in The Hague had 57 different delegations, and the idea was that they had the first reading of what they call a, quote, zero draft of the proposed international instrument. And I know that's incredibly nerdy, but I think it's just interesting to see sort of the reality of how things work. I think that's also a good link for us to encourage people to listen also to the interview with Chiara Giorgetti. She's actually on the board of the Ukraine Register of Damages. She's right in the thick of these discussions about claims commissions, and she can provide all kinds of context because she's been involved in lots of different claims commissions. And that's going to be up on our Patreon feed this week if you want to support us and want to tune into that. And of course, we'll put it out on the main feed later. So thanks very much for all of that stuff that you collected, Steph.
This was Asymmetrical Haircuts, your international justice podcast, created and presented by Janet Anderson and Stephanie van den Berg. This episode has been recorded at home, but we'd like to give a shout out to our regular host, Humanity Hub in The Hague. Music is by audionautics.com, and you can find show notes and everything about the podcast on asymmetricalhaircuts.com. This show is available on every major podcast service, so please subscribe, give us a rating, and spread the word.